This is a conversation with Andrias Kubilius, the European Union's Commissioner for Defense and Space. For those not that familiar with the European Union, a commissioner is basically something like a minister in a nation state, a top politician responsible for a particular area. Historically, the EU has never had a defense commissioner because it is not a military organization, but that has changed quite radically since the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And in 2023, Andrias became the first ever EU's defense commissioner, responsible primarily for rearming Europe, rebuilding its defense industry, and making it more able and ready to defend itself. It is a pretty important role, and as the European Union is trying to act more as an independent geopolitical actor, it's only about to become more important. And for how important the role is, this conversation was extremely open and transparent. We talked about how to make the European Union more prepared to survive in an increasingly dangerous world without anyone coming in to save it. Both about what is he doing to make that happen, but also how the European Union needs to change in order to make that possible, including, for example, why he believes that we need a true European army. We talk a lot about the complicated relationship with the United States, about how and why Europe needs to start immediately preparing for the United States withdrawing from Europe, about what will be the future of NATO once or if that happens, and whether the EU could replace it, and what would happen if the United States decides to take Greenland by force. What would be the European response to that, and how destructive that would be for everyone. And about his views on the new US national security strategy, which he is very critical of, and which frames the very institution he represents, the European Union, as an opposition to the interests of the United States, and something that the US should try to dismantle. And of course, we talk about Russia, about how likely he thinks the threat of a Russian aggression against EU or NATO member states actually is, or how prepared Europe currently is to defend itself without the United States against something like that, and much more. This podcast and interviews like this can exist only thanks to its supporters on Patreon and Substack, to whom I'm deeply grateful, and who get a bunch of perks in return for their support, including the full ad-free version of this and other episodes, and additional bonus perks. And if you want to get even more geopolitical analysis, I also write a newsletter. You can find the link in the description. And now, enjoy the conversation. Okay, so welcome to the podcast.
My pleasure.
So there is a lot to talk about, and I have many things that I'd like to discuss with you. But I think first, I'd like to start with your role and what it actually means. Because you are the first ever, historically, European Union Commissioner for Defense and Space. And when you started, when the role was first created, there was a lot of, I think, confusion and speculation about what the role will actually look like. What is it for? How it can be useful? What can a commissioner actually do? Because historically, the European Union has never really involved in defense too much, because it is not a military organization, and because it has been something that was a focus of member states and national states. And you now have been in this role for over a year. And so you've had quite a lot of exposure to it already. How do you now personally see and understand the purpose and the meaning of this role of an EU Commissioner for Defense? And what is maybe one thing, if you just had to say one thing, that you want to achieve in this role, so that when you leave, you know that it was a success and that it was worth it?
Well, first of all, thanks a lot for a very broad question, especially on the role of commissioner and the first commissioner. Sometimes I'm joking because since I'm the first one, I'm the best, because there is nobody to compare. But more seriously, really, the role of commissioner and the role of the whole European Union in defense is evolving. So it's really, you cannot say that there is very strict, description is what what commissioner should do and what commissioner is not able to do. Definitely, we need to take into account what are the treaties. Treaties are saying that defense is, sovereign right and obligation of the member states. So that limits the role of the European Union in general. But again, I'm always saying that we need to have in mind the whole issue of defense readiness. That is what we need to talk about. And when we're talking about defense readiness, I'm always saying that there are three major pillars in defense readiness. One is material one. It means material defense readiness. It means, weapons, production, procurement, financial means, and so on and so on. That is what we were doing from the very beginning during the whole last year. Second is what I call institutional defense readiness. How we're organizing ourselves in Europe, especially if we have in mind that perhaps Americans will start to diminish their presence on the European continent, and we need to be ready to defend Europe with less of America. And that is what Commission President always is speaking about, independence of Europe. That we need to build capacities to be able to defend ourselves more or less independent. And the last pillar is what I call political defense readiness, how to defend our political will against especially Russian hybrid attacks, to defend ourselves. Because you can have weapons, but you can lose your political will to use those weapons. So those three pillars are the whole, house or dome we can call of defense readiness, and they are very much interrelated in between. So definitely you can say, okay, my responsibility mostly is about material defense readiness, and that is what we were doing during the whole last year. But I see very clearly that in material defense readiness we have some structural problems, like, for example, fragmentation of defense industry, which creates a lot of really very big and deep problems in our possibilities to build our capabilities, to strengthen our defense industry, and so on. And those challenges and those issues will not be resolved if we shall not start to look much more deeply into institutional defense readiness. How, despite the fact that our defense policies are very much, if I can call, nationalized, how to become much more united, how to have this European dimension of the whole Europe much more visible in all our defense preparations. So, and I see that if last year was more, we needed to devote much more of our attention towards material defense readiness. Now I see that there are some limits what we can achieve with material defense readiness if we shall not start to look much more deeply into institutional defense readiness. So that is why, in my view, this year priorities can shift much more towards institutional defense readiness issue.
So if I understand that correctly, and maybe correct me if I'm wrong, but it sounds like you think that it would be better for Europe if the EU would do more on defense and start playing a bigger role in defense than it is now, than just buying equipment and procuring the material, but that it should take up maybe more responsibility. Is that correct? And maybe in what specific ways do you think, where should Europe be doing more to improve this readiness?
Well, that is an opinion that really Europe needs to do more, and to look not only into how to spend the money, how to spend more money, and but also there is a lot of opinions which are saying, well, this is not enough. If we are asking ourselves a very simple question, okay, how much Europe is ready to defend itself with less of America? There are very brilliant recent different analytical papers published on both sides of Atlantic on this topic. And there are, of course, very, very clear questions. for example, how we shall build the European pillar of NATO. And who is going to build it, Perhaps NATO itself will not build, for us, European pillar of NATO. So it means that we as Europeans, we need to start to look how we can do that. And I'm not saying that this is Commission role to provide recipe, and to to have a regulation on how we should build that pillar. But definitely, this is a topic which Europeans, we as Europeans, either on member states level or in European Parliament, in the Council and Commission, we need to start to discuss. And there are a lot of other similar issues, like, for example, who will replace, if Americans are withdrawing, who will replace so-called backbone military force, which Americans till now were providing with 100,000 troops, ready, always to move, being located in Europe, but much more cohesive if to compare with our, collection of 27 military forces which we have, and in some cases which some prominent Europeans, for example, Joseph Borrell was calling bonsai armies, like nice, small and used for decoration, So, miniature, those are the questions which we need to approach in a very, practical way. And what we need also to see that some of discussions about those issues, European pillar of NATO, or let's say European backbone military force, or even European army, were raised up even 10 years ago by Emmanuel Macron, by Angela Merkel, very famous speeches by Jean-Claude Juncker, on those topics. But things were not happening. It were not materialized. And I see, first of all, the question, why, we need to answer the question, why they were not materializing. And in my view, the issue and challenge always was that we had no proper format or some kind of arrangement where those questions should be discussed in a very serious and deep way, and where, in some way, agreements would be achieved, then those agreements should be materialized. And in my view, really, again, one of the ideas which were proposed back in 2017 and 18 by Macron and Merkel could be revitalized, speaking about so-called European Security Council, where the proposal was, that to have smaller group of member states, especially those influential member states, and to create, out from that, some kind of platform for really deep discussions. So now we see, despite the fact that that idea about European Security Council in some way was, how to say, forgotten, because it was proposed, first of all, in order to maybe to offer some kind of platform to have United Kingdom involved in those discussions. But now it comes back through a different arrangement, so-called E5 plus arrangement, where, Germany, France, Italy, United Kingdom, and Poland, sometimes Spain, are coming together to discuss very important issues, for example, security guarantees for Ukraine. But in my view, they could be, such a kind of format could be more formalized into this, European Security Council, like having, this E5 plus, and, in addition to that, maybe 3 countries on rotational basis, and the leaders of European institutions like Commission President and Council President. And that could be, in my view, one of the effective platforms in order to discuss exactly those issues, where institutional issues, where we need to have proper answers in order to move ahead.
Just a quick break here. If you care about geopolitics, and I assume you do since you're listening to this, you might want to consider signing up to get my newsletter. Station 0. Once every week or two, you'll get a free geopolitical analysis, a story, trend, or pattern of something that's really important but that most people tend to miss. Like the one where I talk about the major threat that Hungary's Prime Minister, Viktor Orban, is facing, why he's increasingly likely to be defeated in the next year's elections, why his new challenger is not at all who you would expect, and why it might be a lesson for politicians everywhere. If you want to sign up, just click the link in the description. And now, back to the conversation. You've mentioned, by the way, I agree completely that we do need to have these discussions, and I'm happy to hear that they're happening. I wonder, you've mentioned an idea of a European army, and it's something that you've mentioned recently, past year as well. And I thought it was quite a big deal that you specifically are talking about this openly. And I would love to hear your thoughts on that, whether you think that's something that is realistic, because it is usually dismissed as something completely unrealistic. So whether you think that it is something that's worth discussing, and that perhaps that you see as a realistic potential vision for the coming 5 to 10 years, or if we should focus on other avenues instead of this one.
Well, first of all, the question is, what do we have in mind when we're talking about European army? And and I was quite inspired or impressed with very good analysis recently published by CSIS from Washington D.C., think tank from Center for Strategic and International Studies from Washington D.C. With very good title, how Europe needs to be to defend itself with less of America. And they put some kind of very clear analysis what kind of challenges we shall face, and exactly this challenge of how we shall replace this backbone military force on the European continent, which now is placed by 100,000 American troops. That is a very crucial question, and I understand, and I was skeptical several years ago when somebody was proposing European army. For me, it looked like okay, then it will split us, in NATO. We need to have Americans, here in Europe. So let's not compete with Americans. But now things are changing. We need to accept those changes. And in my view, Americans have all the right. I will not, here analyze recent developments, Venezuela and so on, and threats to Greenland. But in any case, Americans have all the rational arguments why when they're saying that they will need to ship more and more to Indo-Pacific to mitigate rising Chinese military power, and we as Europeans, we need to accept that, and we need to start to prepare ourselves for that. So it's good that Americans are in some way urging us to build our own independence. And when we are looking into what does it mean to build our independence, we need to see that we shall need not only to replace, let's say, the strategic enablers which now Americans are providing, like air refueling or some, space services, intelligence services, and so on. But also we shall need to replace with this, backbone military force. And the question is how we are going to do that. With a collection of 27, those bonsai armies, or we shall ask whatever, Germans maybe to provide, that force, or we shall look how we can create really a standing, military force, united, under European command inside of NATO, and really to have possibility to have very, very rapidly moving military force, which Americans now such capability have, and that is very practical question. I do not see here any kind of that this issue would violate anybody, sovereign rights and so on. It's simply a practical question how we can build that some kind of such force. And I would be very keen to see proper discussion about that. But what to discuss? And in my view, the best way is to discuss such kind of issue really is exactly this, national European Security Council.
I just think it's interesting because you get to interact with all these European leaders at the very highest level. So when you talk with them, do you talk about these practical questions? Is there the understanding that, Americans are probably leaving one way or another, or to some extent from Europe? We need to be discussing these questions. And are these discussions happening? Are people aware that, it's becoming quite an urgent issue?
Well, we are discussing, of course, but I would say that, even without my own participation, I can quote unquote, all the different leaders from different European institutions or different member states who are saying that really, what Commission President is calling independence of Europe now is the topic which is becoming a central topic. Friedrich Merz recently said, the time of Pax Americana is over, we cannot anymore, hope that Americans forever will provide us with security guarantees, and we need to build our own capabilities. Emmanuel Macron was speaking that, for the last 10 years. So I don't know if he changed his mind recently, but so we can see that this topic, which maybe 10 years ago it looked like a little bit, how to say, a long visionary or theoretical question, now it's becoming quite a practical question. So that's why I think that those discussions need to continue. I hope that we can find the proper format where those discussions should go in a most effective and deep way. This E5 plus, format for me looks very attractive. And, definitely this is nothing new. Always big ideas in Europe usually were discussed first of all about, among German, French, Italian, United Kingdom, leaders, and then others were following. So we should go similar way.
I wanted to ask you on something that I think is closely related to that, because I think that a lot of what we were talking about means closer European integration. And that needs to happen because the United States are leaving Europe or lowering their presence. But quite recently, the United States have put out their new national security strategy that you wrote about as well, where they write about Europe and where they write about European Union, and where they, to quote you, show clear antagonism towards the European Union. And you also said that in that document, EU unity is against US interests. And I wonder, what's your view on how do we square that? How do we square that, you are that Europe needs more integration, probably, but at the same time, you yourself are saying that America is opposing that more integration, and it would actually maybe trying to dismantle the existing European Union. So how do you see that yourself, and what do you think the European Union and Europe's approach to that should be?
Well, definitely, I am big fan of Europe to become, more united and more integrated. So, American position does not change my understanding. And sometimes even when we Europeans are facing some kind of challenges to us, critical challenges, we are becoming even more united. So maybe even that, American opposition to our unity can help us in some way. Well, but I cannot, elaborate too much. In my view, this is very mistaken approach. I was trying to show that it's really more deep than just, propaganda of MAGA, recent propaganda of MAGA, to to speak out. Really, it comes from the much more deep strategic thinking. I was quoting the famous book by Elbridge Colby, who is now defense undersecretary on defense policy, not defense. Now it's war undersecretary. And his famous book, The Strategy of Denial, where it's really explained why the Americans are in some way not in favor of Europe to become more united, because I'm just can repeat very shortly my what I understood from that book. That Americans are looking with some kind of worry if in any continent or in any territory there is there appears the country or power which starts to become hegemonic in that area. And China, that is the danger for American interest in Asia, that China can become a hegemon in Asia. And in Europe, they see that European Union as an organization can become a hegemon. And that is why they're saying, well, that's not what they want to see. Well, I think that this is a wrong approach. It's a mistaken approach. We need to discuss with Americans. I do not know what else we can do. We need to discuss with them that it's a wrong approach, and that even for America, it would be better if Europe would become more united, stronger, able really to be an equal partner to United States here on the European continent, and able to take care about stability in Europe and in our neighborhood, Middle East, and then even Africa demands attention much more. Arctic is demanding attention. So let's talk with Americans.
And do you think it can be explained that, talking with them can produce a successful outcome, that you can explain to the current administration or to MAGA Republicans that actually more united Europe would be good thing for America as well?
Well, we need to try. We need to try to speak. Definitely, it's we shall not. How to say? We have a lot of arguments, and we shall not lose anything. The question is, for us, maybe a challenge to understand really, in some way, American way of thinking, and I feel that we are facing some kind of transition in the very, very strategic approach to global issues. For example, what does it mean, concentration of United States on Western Hemisphere? What they were speaking in the strategy, and now we see in some way evidence. Does it shows American power, or does it show that Americans are starting to understand the limits of their power? That they cannot, pretend to be anymore, the single, power in the world, which has monopoly and so on, because China is rising, some other forces are rising, and that is why Americans are withdrawing from the global affairs and saying, okay, at least, Western Hemisphere, we shall try to control. I see that as some kind of transition which we need to understand. I'm not so sure that this is my right analysis, what I'm saying, but I see that for us, for Europeans, there is a need to have more deep, deep discussions, more deep analysis of what does it mean. It's one thing is all that emotions and how to say, sometimes really very nasty language which Americans American administration for time being is using against Europeans. So okay, we we shall survive through that. But the question is really what is behind that? What is much more deep, inside of that strategy? That is a very important issue for us to understand.
Well, I think I do have to ask, because it is, I think, something that right now Europeans are discussing, and they're asking themselves very intensely. And that's the issue of Greenland, and the fact that the administration have been talking about the United States needing to control Greenland, or taking it from Denmark, which is an EU member in some way. And I don't want you to speculate, but I think it would still be really interesting to hear your thoughts on On that broadly, and how we should as Europeans understand what, these remarks and claims mean, how should we take it? And also, what do you think should be the European Union's response and Europe's response to that, both to those claims and words, but also if that ever, turns into a reality? Thank you for listening to the free part of this interview. The conversation is not over yet, but the next part is only for the paid members on my Patreon or Substack. I try to make the best possible geopolitics content, and I put a lot of effort and time into this podcast. And there's quite a lot of costs that I have to pay that are associated with it. It's the supporters on Patreon that allow me to do all that, and making part of every single interview exclusively available only for them is my way of saying thank you, since without them, it just wouldn't exist. So if you want to listen to the rest of the interview, ask questions to guests who appear on the show, or myself, get bonus content and my own takes on geopolitics, become part of an active community of geopolitics enthusiasts, and most importantly, make the continued existence of this podcast possible, do consider becoming a supporter. It really helps. To join, you can find the link in the description or go to patreon.com/decodinggeopolitics.